Um, the Communist Party is currently the second largest and most powerful party in Russia today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of people think that when the Soviet Union fell, that communism just completely died in
Mm-mm.
Russia with it, which is a very fallacious belief. Communism is still alive and well in Russia.
Yep.
Some 60% of the Russian people, according to polling by Levada, would prefer to have the old Soviet Union back again.
Mm-hmm.
That comes as a shock to a lot of people in the West. Also, some 70 to 75%, depending on the poll, of Russians today still look upon Joseph Stalin as the greatest leader that they ever had because he won World War II, because he built the
Mm-hmm.
Soviet Union up from
He
a
defeated the
peasant farm,
Nazis.
and he defeated the Nazis. That's the main thing. So that brings us to
Put
Victory
people,
Day
you
and
know.
back to our man, Scott Ritter, who was lucky enough to be in Moscow this week. Because of security concerns, they wouldn't let him attend the Victory Day parade ceremony on May the 9th, which was probably wise. And Scott's going to explain to us why that is. He filed a report for us. And Jeff, if you have that ready, take a look at this, guys. He got to attend the dress rehearsals, and it's really cool. Let's take a look.
The Russian government hadn't signed the final order for May 9th because of security concerns. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is the day of the Victory Day parade on May 9th, Ukraine sent 3 drones against Moscow. They were all shot down by Russian air defense. But, to anybody who thinks that the Russians are being paranoid and such about security, no, Moscow was attacked on Victory Day. So the decision was that if I was going to have an opportunity to see the parade, to go ahead and see the full-scale rehearsal on May 7th, which it's the full parade. I mean, President Putin wasn't there; he didn't give his address, but as you can see, the
I was going to say, for a rehearsal, it looks like an awfully elaborate affair and a lot of people there.
Oh no! First of all, it's very difficult to get tickets to this. The stands were full of special invited guests, and it's to be able to get a ticket to this show was amazing, and it was it was the real deal. They did everything. The emotion of the soldiers, the emotion of the audience, everything was genuine. This was if you couldn't be at the actual parade, this was the next best thing.
So what'd you do? You slipped a C note into the hand of the usher or something to get in?
Oh God, no. They locked down the center of Moscow. I think I went through easily a dozen security checkpoints. They had they had snipers up on the roof. They had guys with drone guns walking around. They had dogs.
Mm-hmm.
They checked everything, and I'm pretty sure I was the only American there. The surprise of some of the security guards when I handed them my American passport was obvious. They were like, "What the hell do we do with this American?" They had to call in their colonels, and then they realized that I actually had a ticket and was invited, and I got it with no problem. Look,
well, weren't you with somebody of an official nature, or were you just by yourself?
Oh no. I'm always with somebody of an official nature, and the gentleman rapidly resolved the issue. So.
And who took this video? Was this you or Vika?
No, this is me. Unfortunately, Vika on this day, she's still completing her schoolwork, so she had to miss this opportunity and get an assignment done.
I see. Well, priorities. So cinematography by our favorite weapons inspector.
Well, there you go. I tell you again. There's a I don't know if I sent it to you. There was a clip right before the Russian national anthem plays, and you hear the soldiers, shout out "Hoorah!" And to hear thousands of
yeah, that was in there, but I mean, I'm killing the volume so that you can talk over.
No, but I mean, I think people should hear that. That's a spectacular moment.
I don't know how to find it though. That's the only thing. We can get that for the next episode or something. And what's this all about?
Yeah. I had an opportunity to speak at the Writers Union, and I, of course, proudly exclaimed my heritage as being a Marine. And the director said, "Well, he is a paratrooper." And I said, "Well, we're going to have to settle this man to man." And he put his arm up first. So,
all right.
So
it's much like your duel with Ryan Milton. It's not really clear who won.
I love that.
Scott
cool. Ritter having the time of his life over there. I must say, I'm a little envious, and I bet you are. Of course, any true communist would love to be in Moscow for a Victory Day celebration.
So much to learn.
And I think our guest is here. Is Caleb with us? Let's bring in our special guest.
Oh, my brother.
How are you?
Hello.
Hi, Caleb. This man probably needs no introduction. I'll just say that he is a reporter for RT, also the founder of the Center for Political Innovation and author of the new book, Where is America Going? MAGA, Marxism, and the Coming Revolution. Very intriguing title. Wonderful book, Caleb. I've been enjoying it a great deal, and I've read it once, and now I keep going back to it to sort of cite things. And your chapter 4 is actually what inspired this conversation in this broadcast tonight. So thank you so much for joining us, Caleb. It's always a pleasure talking to you, my brother. And I wanted to just start off talking a little bit about World War II and the Soviets' incredible contribution to that war, and why it is honored in Victory Day in Russia and what that means to the Russian people.
Well, World War II is something that's really important to almost every American family. I mean, if your family was here 2 generations ago, if you're like me, I'd go over to my grandparents' house, and both sides, they'd get out the photo albums and they'd show us when they were in Europe or they were in the Pacific. It was just a big moment. And it's the same in Russia, right? I mean, every Russian family lost multiple relatives. I mean, it was, we're talking between 20 and 27 million people in the former Soviet Union dying. It was a pivotal moment, but it was a moment in which the whole country came together to repel foreign invaders. And what was special about that moment was the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese were together against fascism. And we were allies, and there's some great, history that's been forgotten. There was a hit song during World War II by the San Francisco Quartet, the Golden Gate Quartet. Stalin wasn't Stalin, talking about Stalin's heroic fight against the Nazi invaders. There's a Why We Fight newsreel film that was shown to soldiers called The Battle of Russia.
Oh, it's one of my favorite movies ever. It's on YouTube. Everybody go watch The Battle of Russia, made in 1943 by the United States government. Yes, we once did Russian propaganda.
The vice president of the United States, Henry Wallace, gave this amazing speech called The Century for the Common Man that, is just really powerful. It talks about our heritage from our revolution of 1776 and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 being from the same cloth of trying to raise the conditions of the working people. Really powerful stuff. And, that history has been lost. They want us to be convinced that the Russians are our enemies. But it wasn't just World War II. In the American Civil War, when Lincoln was rallying the country to defeat slavery, there was talk of the British sending their Navy to support the South to break the naval blockade. And so the Russians sent their Navy to New York City's harbor. And let's not forget, in the American Revolution, the Russians were on our side. The American Revolution, the Russians were with us. In the Civil War against slavery, the Russians were with us. In World War II against fascism, the Russians were with us. When it counts, the Russians are on our side. And I would also say that the British were technically on our side during World War II, but they certainly weren't on our side against the Confederacy, and they certainly weren't on our side in the American Revolution, and that maybe we should be a little bit more distrustful of the British Empire.
Ding, 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 ding.
And Franklin Roosevelt was very distrustful of the British Empire. He was an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. It's one of the things he had in common with Stalin. And even though Roosevelt was not a communist, even though he was often accused of being a communist or having communist sympathies, he did manage to forge a real friendship with Joseph Stalin, had a lot of respect for Stalin. And there's a wonderful book by Susan Butler that I would recommend to anyone interested in our World War II history and our alliance with the Soviet Union. And it's just called Roosevelt and Stalin by Susan Butler. And it's one of the few honest histories that you can read about it, because as we were talking before you came on, Caleb, Tyler and I were talking about our education system here in the United States since World War II. We immediately turned around and stabbed our ally in the back. Before the war was even over, Churchill had dreamed up Operation Unthinkable. We were going to work together with the Nazis and go invade Russia, which was insane, but they were seriously thinking about it. And that was the beginning of the Cold War. Then we spent the next 40 years telling everyone to hate our former ally. And I can't imagine that going down well with a lot of veterans of World War II who were in Europe, who fought side by side with the Red Army, forged forever friendships with those communists. And it didn't matter if they were communists, they were together, united, fighting fascism, and became friends for life. They continued to write each other letters into their old age, So this anti-communism thing that they tried to shove down our throats after the war didn't sell with everybody. And it's important to point that out, that a lot of veterans of World War II were not on board with this McCarthyism crap. Let's talk a little bit about Joseph McCarthy, McCarthyism, and the Cold War, Caleb.
Sure. Well,
what was that all about?
McCarthyism started out as the Democratic Party clearing their own house. There was the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party, people who'd supported Roosevelt, who'd been leaders of the labor movement, and they were a huge layer of the Democratic Party that was sympathetic and friendly with the Communist Party, that wanted to maintain friendship with the Soviet Union. You had Henry Wallace, who'd been the vice president during World War II, and you had a lot of different figures, Alger Hiss, who'd been the UN ambassador or a founder of the United Nations, and others. And
Avril Harriman.
A number of figures from the Roosevelt administration who weren't communists, but they had the attitude that the communists were good people. They were allies. Maybe they didn't agree about this or that, but they were allies. They were friends in the fight against fascism. They raised important issues like the need to oppose Jim Crow segregation and racism, the need to fight for labor unions and the rights.
They were Nazi killers.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the Democratic Party's urban political machines, in particular, you had Al Smith and the urban political machine of New York City. You had the Rizzo machine in Philadelphia, the Chicago machine, et cetera. They rallied their forces to purge the Democratic Party of this communist sympathetic wing. And that was the beginning. But then after that, you had the Chinese Revolution being victorious in 1949. And then it shifted to the Republicans, accusing the Democrats of being soft on communism, right? The rallying
does that sound familiar today?
Yeah. And it was who lost China? That was the rallying cry, as if China were the property of Wall Street, right? And that Truman had lost China. He'd let China go to the hands of the communists. And so the Republicans started accusing the Democrats of being the communists, being soft on communism. And then from there, it turned into, you had the rise of Joe McCarthy, and it turned into kind of a middle-class uprising against the American political establishment, with all kinds of people being accused of being communists, with the Voice of America, the U.S. government propaganda broadcasts being accused of being communist, U.S. Army being accused of being communists. You had a member of the U.S. Congress, a senator, who committed suicide because Joe McCarthy found out that his son was gay and blackmailed him with it, and he ultimately killed himself. And it got so out of hand that ultimately some of the richest and powerful people, stepped in. You had Edward R. Murrow on national TV, and McCarthyism slowed down. But what it actually meant in the real life of average Americans is something people don't talk about. I mean, it was bad. And I've talked to older people. That was really, a privilege to go talk to older people who'd lived through that time, communist Americans, and what they suffered. And it was intense. I mean,
school teachers got fired, didn't they?
Yeah, well, there was an older woman. I sat on her couch in her living room, and she told me about how she got fired. That she was living in Buffalo, New York, and all the Communist Party members that were steel workers got fired from the steel mill. So she and her friends had a protest outside the steel mill saying that, that steel workers have the right to join whatever party they want, communist, Democrat, Republican, or whatever. The next day, the FBI showed up at her school with photographs of her, and she got called down to the principal's office. And the principal said, "Is that you at this communist demonstration?" She said, "Yes, you're fired." And they printed her home address and her name along with every other person who'd been at that protest in the Buffalo Evening News, right? That was how things were.
And that was very typical at that time. Yeah. Very typical.
The other thing that I heard about, and this is fascinating to me, is in the public libraries, they tended to have books about Marx and Lenin and Stalin and such, but they would put them behind the counter. And if you wanted to go get a book, the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx, you had to show some ID. And they would write your name down. And there was a good chance the FBI might come knock on your door that night and say, "Why were you looking at that book? Are you tied to any subversive organization?" It was pretty totalitarian. People forget how extreme it was.
And the amazing thing is the American people went along with it. They supported this wholeheartedly. The majority were like, yeah, let's, get those communist books out of our schools and root those communists out of our society. And
there's still some holdover
don't
from
have
that.
any rights.
I mean, this year even, I had a parent threaten they were going to bring the local representative to the school board. And I was like, bring it. That'll make some great YouTube material. I'll film it and we'll have a lot of fun. I'll answer questions. Ask the communists, it'll be fun. But there's still holdover from it. And I'm pretty sure, Caleb, you might be able to explain to me, but the tenure system in public education largely comes from that time, right? Because afterwards, teachers were like, we can't let people just run us off for trying to help people politically.
Well, that was the rallying cry of academic freedom, right? It's very hard, especially in a university, to get rid of a tenured professor because they wanted to make sure that professors, the idea was that universities could be kind of, America's conscience, ask the tough questions, challenge things. And that was the idea. And part of the shift into the Kennedy years and into, Johnson and the was kind of a blowback to McCarthyism. McCarthyism got so out of hand and crazy. You read about the peak skill riot that happened where there was like a concert where Pete Seeger and some musicians were playing and thousands of people assembled. It was like a lynch mob that assembled. People lost their eyes and got very badly injured. But when you say the majority of the American people supported it, the reason was because the economy was so good at that point. Coming out of World War II, the USA just had this huge surge in the economy. And then at the same time, this new invention, this electronic talking box called a television, everyone had in their home. And suddenly the ability of the government and the mainstream media to psych people up was so much more enhanced. And just every night they were pumping Americans full of fear. At the same time, Americans had a good standard of living. So they were like, things have finally gotten good. We just came out of the Great Depression. Now we've all got houses and cars and TVs. Things are going pretty well. And then they have this electronic box saying, oh my God, the Russians are going to nuke you. And, they have the children in school practicing hiding under their desks. And it was kind of a perfect storm to persecute the class struggle labor organization. And, and that McCarthyism didn't just hurt communists. I mean, it hurt the labor movement. Labor unions in this country were very significantly weakened by the Taft-Hartley anti-labor law. Which basically that's a law that makes it very hard for workers to unionize. It used to be that if 51% of the workers in any factory, any workplace said, I want to join the union, they got a union, period. Now there's a long 2-year process that's overseen by the National Labor Relations Board that makes it very difficult to bring a union contract into a workplace. And that's because of McCarthyism. Another thing was that, and it's very interesting because, now they accuse the various communist governments of being homophobic or transphobic or whatever, but they used McCarthyism to crack down on LGBT people. They passed a law that no gay person could work for the federal government. There
was that assumption that if you were a commie, you were gay.
And vice versa.
I don't know where that came from, but it was a thing back then.
What was weird was that Joe McCarthy himself was gay, right? And
so was Roy Cohn, his co-counsel.
His lawyer, Roy Cohn, died of HIV years later, and that Joe McCarthy, there was a national news story that came out that said he was known to be gay. So the next day, he married his secretary to prove he wasn't gay, and everyone asked some interesting questions about that. And, that was a whole very, very weird thing. And that, the whole thing was just it was an odd moment in American history. And it started out as trying to purge the influence of Roosevelt and the popular anti-fascist alliance that Roosevelt had built. And then it turned into something else. And if you watch the Twilight Zone, which is a great TV show from the early 60s, that show is very much, that's an answer to McCarthyism. That's like warning. Almost every episode practically is warning the audience about how dangerous McCarthyism can be.
Yes. That's
well,
right.
I somebody didn't like my flag. Maybe they'll like this one better. But here's my question, Caleb. So in the 1930s, when America's economy was just booming and doing fantastic in the Great Depression years, meanwhile, Stalin's Soviet Union was going straight up. It was kind of my understanding that labor unions were really taking off. I mean, The Grapes of Wrath was the biggest selling book in 1939, and they made the movie immediately. It was like hotcakes. We'll make it in 1940 with Henry Fonda. And then this war happened, and Americans, as always, don't want to go. I like that, Coop. They don't want to go to war, right? So they're eventually like, okay, it's Hitler. All right, we'll go fight Hitler, sure. But as soon as we get back, we are picking back up this union stuff, and we're going to get what we deserve. And as soon as they landed back, what hits them? The Taft-Hartley Act, right? In the teeth. Right. No, you're not going to come back. And then you got McCarthyism right after that, and luckily, the economy picked up, and it worked. But if it stayed like crap, it wouldn't have worked.
I wanted to add something because I'm kind of a history nerd, and I spend a lot of time reading declassified CIA documents. Recently, I've been delving into piles of documents that were declassified under a law passed in 1998 called the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. And boy, there's some juicy stuff in there, guys, especially when it comes to our friends, the Ukrainian nationalists, the Nazis in Ukraine. They've actually been our friends since the end of the Second World War. And just as we were bringing over German Nazis to the United States and bringing them into NASA, bringing them into the CIA, we were also bringing in a lot of Ukrainian nationalists because they were helpful to fight the Soviet Union. The CIA, the government was funding, arming, and training these guys to do guerrilla warfare, basically trying to do regime change in the Soviet Union, quite unsuccessfully, I might add. The Soviets caught these guys and, killed most of them. But it was a very unsuccessful operation. But I wanted to say something that I found very interesting. I found a trail of documents that basically described why we had a Cold War, why the national security state, basically the NSA and the CIA, were invented in the first place. During the Truman administration in 1947, there was a concern, and it's an understandable one, after the Soviets, the Red Army, won World War II in Europe. And there's no disputing that fact. I know that we were all taught in school that the Americans and the English and the French beat the Nazis in Europe, but that's just
Tom Hanks,
a lie.
Saving Private Ryan.
It's a lie. It's not true. Really, only about 20% of the fighting force, the Allied fighting force in Europe, was comprised of American, British, and French troops. 80% were Soviet troops. They did the heavy lifting. They took the heaviest losses. They inflicted 80% of Nazi casualties. So, after liberating these Nazi-occupied territories across Europe, there was a wave of interest in communism. Understandably so. In the Allied nations that had traditionally been capitalist, they started to love the Soviets. There was this feeling of thank you for saving us from the Nazis. Thank you. And what is this communism stuff? Tell me more. That really upset a lot of people at the CIA and MI6 and the American government and the British government, and especially Winston Churchill said, hold on a minute. We are not going to let this communism thing start spreading around the world. That's when we started hearing things like the domino theory, right? In the 50s and 60s, as communism was indeed spreading, especially through Asia, they were telling us, oh, this is dangerous. We have to stop this. Right. And so we fought a couple of wars about it. We fought a war in Korea about it. We fought a war in Vietnam about it, supposedly to stop communism. And what happened? The communists won. That's what happened. Vietnam is a communist nation today. So we lost that one. We lost the Korean conflict as well. And so really my point is the whole reason that the CIA and the national security state was created in the first place was anti-communism. It's the whole reason that justified the existence of the CIA for most of that agency's existence. And I'm going to take you back even further. The FBI was created for the same purpose back in the 1920s during the first Red Scare. You know, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, America panicked. We freaked out and said, oh my God, there's Reds under the bed. Get them out of here. And so we started deporting them out of the country and throwing them in prison. And
there you go.
All that. J. Edgar Hoover's paycheck was literally justified his entire career because of communism, anti-communism, fanatical anti-communism. And Caleb has done so many great lectures. You know, he does a live stream on his YouTube channel, which is a really great place to get some history that isn't taught properly in our schools, the real history, the hidden history. And he can school you about what the FBI did to communist and leftist organizations under COINTELPRO. And, you know, we all know a lot about that, how they came after Dr. Martin Luther King, stalked him for years because they assumed he was a communist or surrounded by communists who were influencing him. And the American Civil Rights Movement was always supported by the communists. It was the Soviet Union that was actually funding quite a bit of, a lot of those groups were being funded by the Soviets. And they were always historically the ones agitating for equal rights for people of color in the United States. So did you have any other comments before we go to questions, Caleb? Do you want to add to that at all?
Well, I guess I just wanted to say that the anti-communism has always had an oddly pro-fascist bent to it. One of the categories they used to have during the McCarthy period is that the FBI, they had categories. They had, you know, communist, if you were a party member. They had, if you weren't a member of the party, but you were like close with them, you were a fellow traveler. But one of their categories they had was a premature anti-fascist. If you were against Hitler too soon, right? You were premature in being against Hitler. You were against Hitler in like 1937, you know, not 1940.
It's like a kid in the classroom, you know, you don't want to judge them too soon. You want to give them room to prove that they're not interested in what you got to say.
Right. He was a premature anti-fascist. That was one category that could get you in trouble.
Same with Hitler in the back row.
Right. But the reason that there was such a surge of interest in communism after World War II is coming out of World War II, the communists looked amazing because they had been warning everybody about the evils of fascism long before the war broke out. In 1935, the World Communist Movement had a gathering, a World Congress of the Communist International, and Dimitrov, who had been a prisoner of Hitler, who'd been freed, he addressed the whole World Communist Movement and said, we need to completely change our orientation. We've got to fight the fascists. They are the main danger. They are the main threat. And we got to build a popular front. And anybody who's against fascism, whether they're a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a liberal, we got to bring them together and we got to show the world that we, the communists, are the most effective anti-fascist fighters. And, you know,
and boy, they did.
And in Britain, you had the Battle of Cable Street, where there was a Nazi sympathizer, a guy named Oswald Mosley. He was going to have a parade through a Jewish neighborhood. And the British Communist Party, they got together thousands and tens of thousands of people, and they said, "You shall not pass," and they shut down the parade. And then in Madison Square Garden, when there was going to be a big Nazi rally, the Communist Party assembled like 90,000 people to like practically shut the thing down. You can watch old newsreels of this guy's in a Nazi uniform and people run up on the stage and try to beat him up. And, you know, it was, everyone knew the communists had been right all along. They'd been warning everybody about how dangerous Hitler was, how dangerous fascism was. And World War II happened. And then in Italy, they were the leaders of the partisan brigades that fought Mussolini. In France, they were the leaders of La Resistance. And I mean, everyone just kind of looked up to the communists during that period. And so they, coming out of the war, the French Communist Party surged, the Italian Communist Party surged, a number of countries around the world just saw a huge surge in Communist Party membership. And it was in America that you saw McCarthyism, this wave of anti-communism. And people almost compare that to the Spanish Inquisition because, you know, back in the 1400s, the Reformation was sweeping Europe, Martin Luther and all of them. But in Spain, where the Catholic Church was strong, they had a crazy, insane crackdown.
Or the Salem witch trials.
Yeah, that's what McCarthyism
read
was.
the Crucible.
America. It was the one place where the communists weren't surging and gaining upper hand. They just completely stomped, you know, because everywhere else communism was on the march. It was like the Spanish Inquisition, you know. So that's a fair comparison you can make. But yeah, there you go. That's my thoughts on that. And I hope that, you know, our audience is hearing us out. I will say that, you know, it can be hard for older folks to hear this because we've been spoon-fed anti-communism our whole lives here in the United States. But things in the United States have changed so dramatically. Living standards are dropping. Americans are against these wars. Americans know that the government is run by a small group of rich people who do not care about them. They know the mainstream media and the politicians and the FBI and the Pentagon are lying to them and manipulating them to serve a group of rich people. That's what communists have been saying all along. So if anything, this should be the moment that we get our opportunity to have a fair say. And I will also say we're not the synthetic left. No. We're not wokes. We are not woke here. We're not into that, right? That's a distortion of our movement. You know, there are people in our movement who are evangelical Christians, members of the Center for Political Innovation. There are people in our movement that are very conservative on a number of questions, and we separate ourselves from the woke left, and we want to make that clear as well.
Absolutely.
You know, Caleb, I just wanted to say before I forget that you've helped clarify so many things for me. This is our ideological leader in CPI, guys, Caleb Maupin. His YouTube channel is fantastic. He has literally like tens of thousands of hours of just educational material. And one of my favorite speeches you gave was your speech about the oil bankers in Brazil. And just from my youth, like in Iraq, I'd hear people say, we're there for the oil, right? Trump and Syria, we're there for the oil. I feel like if you just focus on oil in America, they don't want the oil nationalized. And you can see, if I remember correctly, the CIA was created by law firms for the major oil companies.
Correct.
And
Alan Dulles.
Yeah. While you guys were talking, the CIA was created, was it 47, 48?
47.
Right? 47, the same year of the Taft-Hartley Act. Am I correct?
Taft-Hartley was the next year, 48.
Was it the next year?
Right.
But
and the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, which prevented another FDR. It limited all presidents to 2 terms.
So, I mean, come on. What'd you say last night on your stream, Caleb? You can't say you know for sure, but you can say, that's interesting, isn't it?
Right.
Taft-Hartley and the CIA within the same year, right after the Soviets beat the Nazis? And they're looking better than ever. Their ideology looks better than ever, right after the 1930s and the Great Depression. Interesting timing.
I don't think, guys, that it's a coincidence that we are now in a new Cold War. Anti-communist rhetoric is on the rise again. I mean, just watch the news. Every time they talk about China these days, particularly the Republicans are guilty of this, but you notice how they never can say just China. They always have to preface the word with communist China. When they talk about the Chinese people, they don't just say the Chinese people, they say the communist Chinese.
Except
Pay
when you talk
attention
about
to that when you
economic
watch the
successes.
news.
Yes.
Except when you talk about their economic success.
That's
Whenever
capitalism.
you bring up all the people
Yeah.
they've raised out of poverty and all
Yeah,
that.
that's-
Well, that's because they're capitalists now.
Thank
They're not
God for
communists.
capitalism.
Right.
Yeah.
Somehow they're not communist when they're successful.
when
They're
I
only
think-
communist when they do bad things.
When I
Remember
think
that.
capitalism, I think Chinese Communist Party. That's what I think. You know,
Right.
it's the first thing that comes to mind. And it's also amazing. They always call it the CCP. I'm getting texts from some local Republican running for office, and he's like, Tyler, the dangers of the CCP. And I text back, I go, the CCP doesn't exist. It's the CPC, dude. And you're
There you
texting
go.
everyone in the state the wrong acronym. But that's a good way to tell if you should listen to someone on China or not. Is do they have the right acronym of the party? Because if they're calling it the CCP, they're not calling it by its actual name.
Just like a lot of people still call Russia the Soviet Union,
Soviet
especially the
Union.
older folks. You know, they're still stuck in the Cold War. But I don't think it's a coincidence, guys, that as we see this new anti-communism rising again, do you really think it's a coincidence that fascism is also rising again?
No, you take it away, Caleb. Come on.
I mean,
That's
the
what-
United States government is literally funding fascists in
As
Ukraine.
capitalism collapses, study the history of Germany.
I'm
It
just
breaks
saying.
into two. You get the fascists and you get the communists. When it
Yeah.
It always
collapses,
comes down to that. Age-old enemies
Yep.
from 100 years or more ago. This is an old battle. And here we are again, repeating this retarded thing in the 21st century
Mhm.
that didn't go well for the fascists in the 20th century. And now they're back for a rematch. They're like, come on, we're ready. We got America on our side this
Yeah.
time, Russia. We're going to kick your ass. And Russia's like, actually, we're
You know,
going
I-
to kick your ass all the way back to Berlin, just like we did in 45.
I told a
Don't
kid today,
start a fight with the Russians. You will regret it.
Lori, this is a horrible non sequitur, but a kid called another kid retarded in class today, and I go, "Sir, intellectually disabled, please." And he actually called him intellectually disabled, and then the other kid called him a slur, which I can't repeat. But
Oh, I
Welcome
said
to
the
high school.
politically incorrect word. I know. I said it's
oh,
retarded.
it's okay. I forgive you. I
Well,
love
right,
you.
but then
It
that
It is
was
raises the
retarded.
question, right? Because retarded was originally a polite term. For
There you
another
go.
Term that had been
Yes.
offensive.
But then the
right?
high
And
schoolers
so
got a hold
pretty
of it,
soon,
Caleb.
Everyone's just going to say intellectually disabled, and then
There you
that
go.
will become offensive, and there'll be another polite term. It's just a cycle, you know. There you go. Some of
We
these
say
words that are
retarded.
just like really nasty words now were originally medical terms, like imbecile,
Mhm.
idiot, these kind
Idiot.
of things.
Yep.
Yeah, those were originally.
See, I'm
medical
showing my
terms.
age. I'm an 80s kid because in the 80s we said retarded all the time. Just to say something was stupid, we'd say, "Oh, that's retarded." We didn't mean to be insulting
It's all
anybody.
good,
It was
Lori.
just our way of saying
See,
that
I've
something was dumb.
totally sidetracked the conversation, like a good co-host.
There you go.
We're
I'm
having
the
a
comic
semantical
relief.
argument about insults.
Caleb,
So
to
that-
get us back on track, I just want to know, can you name all the people on this background I found 5 minutes before I got on here?
Oh, sure. We got Marx and Engels and Lenin and Kim Il Sung and Trotsky and Stalin and Earl Browder and Ho Chi Minh and Rosa Luxemburg, Fidel Castro, Mao Zedong, and Che Guevara.
He did it!
Did
Do I
it.
win something? Do I get
You
like
do! You
do I
win
get
my
a-
eternal
a-
respect, sir. And my
of
next
Hawaii or
tithe to the Church of CPI, Grand
All
Leader
right.
Caleb Maupin.
All right, very good.
I knew
Very
you could do
good.
it.
I
Thank you.
want
the Earl
to.
Browder would throw most people off. I think that's the
Good
yeah,
job on
that's
that
the guy
one.
with the mustache who's sitting there looking like that. So there you go.
If you
Yeah.
guys want to learn what communism actually is, the non-woke real version, listen to my boy Caleb Maupin. Follow
Caleb's
his
a
channel.
really good place to
Join
start.
CPI. We'll teach you. We'll teach you the way.